What is up, everybody? Welcome to the 4for Formula 1 podcast with the Monaco GP preview. As always, I am your host, TJ Hernandez, the director of DFS at 4for4.com. And today I'm rolling solo. So we are going to go through this thing. If you're in the comments, let's chat a little bit, ask me some questions, and we could have some fun with this. As always, we are brought to you by Run the Sims for projections tools and content for both F1 and USFL, DFS, and betting. Go to runthesims.com. Use the promo code 4for4 for 10% off offerings. See the link in the description or go to runthesims.com to check that out. Today, we will just jump right into it since I'm rolling solo. We won't go over a big quali or free practice review, but we will talk about the DFS strategy. We'll look at what happened in quali real quick. And since I am rolling solo, hopefully we don't have too many technical difficulties, since I usually have my handy producer here to help me out. But I think we'll be all right. So let's look at the quali results from today. Let me bring them up here real quick. There we go. So we see a front row lockout for Leclerc and Sainz with Perez and Verstappen coming in third, fourth. That's going to be really important for Monaco. As we know, it is a race that is it's known as one of the most boring races on the calendar because there's so little overtaking. Typically, we obviously don't know what it's going to be like with the new cars, but that's how the race is known. Not a lot of overtaking. So that front row lockout is going to be really important for Ferrari. Going to be really tough for Red Bull to get up into first or second place. Then we see Lando with a fifth place finish. Mercedes getting at the sixth spot with George Russell. Alonso 7th, Hamilton 8th. The really surprising and the big value play this week is going to be Vettel at 9th, and then you guys see the rest there. So we will be using that to, as always, that is the basis for our value. We're looking at the quality results versus the salaries. And as I mentioned, the big salary winner this week is Sebastian Vettel. His $3,800 salary is the 17th highest salary, but he's starting at 9th. So he is going to be our best salary versus starting grid value. And the Yuki Tsunoda is also a really good value, starting at 11th, but his $4,200 salary is the 15th highest. So we get some really good value on Yuki there. If we look at the worst salary versus grid values, Valtteri Botos had a really tough one. He is starting, I believe he's starting starting 12th, and he has a 7th highest salary. So down 5 spots if we look at his salary versus grid. So he's going to be a tough one to fit in at 8,200. And then as far as values in terms of salary versus grid, both of the Mercedes drivers, Daniel Ricciardo, Pierre Gasly, all starting 3 spots back in terms of salary versus grid. So as always, what we are always going to base our projections, value, ownership on is going to be the Run the Sims data and tool. Luckily for us today, we got the projections and the optimal rates up before we started the podcast. So let me see if I can share this tab real quick with you guys. And as you'll see there, we got our optimal rates up from Run the Sims. So this is going to be the basis for all of our ownership, and looking team by team, we'll use these to figure out who we want to be overweight on, who we want to be underweight on. And as always, we will go team by team to try to figure out who is the best play by team, and then we'll bring it back with our captain, with our constructor. This is a week where we are back to being able to afford some Max Charles, Red Bull, Ferrari combos. There's only a couple, so we are going to have to get really creative. But before we get into that, let's just go alphabetically here and talk about these teams, starting with Alpine. Alonso is at 6,800. He is starting 7th on the grid. Esteban Ocon is 6,400, starting 10th on the grid. And I think this is a really interesting teammate duo because Alonso is projecting as the 4th highest owned driver in terms of flex position, where Ocon is going to be sub 15%. So even though Monaco is a track where there isn't a lot of overtaking, with Alonso starting 7th and Ocon starting 10th, they're so close to each other, and the ownership projection is so wide that I think this is probably going to be the best team pivot that we have on this race because of that really close start. We are expected to have some rain, and even though there's not going to be a lot of overtaking, the thing that Monaco is going to offer is some variance in terms of drivers going into the wall, drivers crashing into each other, especially on that first lap where things could get really crowded. So at such a small gap in their starting grid position and such a small gap in their salary, only $400, I'm really liking Ocon as one of my favorite team pivots of the week. Let's move on to Aston Martin, and this is a really interesting spot because Aston Martin is a team where we've typically used them as a team that is we kind of split their ownership because they've both typically started. They typically start near the back of the pack. They typically start pretty close to each other, and they're often the lowest salary team besides Williams. The problem this week, as I mentioned before, Vettel is the best salary versus grid value of the week. Starting in 9th at 3,800. Stroll is starting back at 18th at 3,400. So the way we're going to attack this week, as I mentioned, we kind of usually split the ownership. It's usually, like both of them are in 25 to 30% of lineups, so it's kind of easy to go overweight on the cheaper guy. In this spot, Vettel's probably going to be in about half of lineups this week based on the Run the Sims projections. So it's going to be tough to be overweight on him, but you're going to be able to use Stroll. And if you lose Stroll in 15 to 20% of your lineups, you're going to be way overweight. So we're going to use Vettel a lot more in our lineups. Let's call it, 35, 40 to 15% for Stroll, but you're still going to be underweight on Vettel, overweight on Stroll if you use that strategy. So with Vettel starting so far ahead, this is a spot where we're going to eat the cheap chalk. It's something that we haven't done a lot this year because the races have been really good, and these guys usually start pretty close to each other, but this spot we're probably going to eat the chalk. Going to Alfa Romeo, Botos, as I mentioned, one of the worst starting grid versus salary spots of the week at 8,200, starting at 12. He's kind of flirting with that price range where you need to have some first place upside to be able to play him, and we just don't have that with this track. Zhou Guanyu, 3,200, starting 20th. He's interesting because he's going to make a lot of things work, but he's going to need Botas to get into an incident for him to be worth value. It's not like the first couple races where we saw like lineups with Latifi where he can get you a 0 and you still win. Those lineups worked when you're able to jam Max Charles together. It's really tough to do that this week. There's only a couple spots. So for Zhou to pay off, you're going to need Botas to get into an incident. So we're probably not going to be using a lot of Alfa Romeo this week. Zhou, you're only going to use him as a salary relief guy, but it makes sense a couple times. Again, this track is just, there's so much variance in terms of the rain and possible incidents that you can use them in salary relief and just kind of hope for that +5 if Botas does have an incident and we get a finish from Zhou. Are we going to use it a lot? Probably not. If you're playing 20 lineups, you might use them once. If you're playing 150 lineups, maybe 2 or 3 times, but this isn't a huge pivot salary saving contrarian spot for me. AlphaTauri is a really interesting one. We got Yuki at 4,200 starting 11th. He's one of the best salary versus grid values of the week. But we have Gasly at 4,600 starting 17th. So what does that mean for us? It means that Yuki is going to be one of the most popular drivers on the grid. Whereas Gasly starting down at 17th is going to be very underutilized. But Gasly is projecting so far under Yuki Tsunoda in terms of ownership. Yuki in that 30 to 40% range, Gasly in that 10 to 15% range, that you can have Gasly kind of similar to Zhou Guanyu in about 2 out of 10 lineups and be okay with his, even though it's 4,600, it's still low enough since we're not jamming Max and Charles together that he has given you some nice salary savings. So I actually like some pivots to Gasly this week. Moving on to Haas. Kevin Magnussen starting at 13th on the grid at 5,600 with Mick Schumacher 5,200 starting 15th. This is a really tough and awkward salary spot. These are typically spots when they're starting this close to each other where we want to go with a lower owned guy. Kevin Magnussen is going to be more popular than Mick since he's starting ahead of him. He's going to offer that +5. We've seen so often in F1 DFS so far this year that the driver that starts ahead of his teammate is just in so many more lineups. The big thing that I look at, if we look at DraftKings odds on the race winners, K-Mag has the 8th best odds. Now, that's obviously not great. Nobody's likely to win this race outside of the top 2 teams, but compared to Mick Schumacher, Mick has the 16th best odds, so there's a huge gap there, even though they're only starting 2 grid spots apart. And the big difference here is that with K-Mag still projecting sub 20%, you're not getting a ton of leverage by switching to Mick Schumacher, and Monaco is a track where you need to be really close to perfect. Even though we're not going to have a lot of overtakes, any mistake and you're on the wall, and we've seen Mick Schumacher make a lot of racing mistakes so far this season, even in really good positions. So we're not gaining a lot by pivoting to Mick Schumacher with Magnussen projecting, as I said, sub 20%. It just doesn't make a lot of sense there. As far as McLaren goes, there is a huge salary discrepancy. We have Lando at 7,400 and we have Ricciardo at 5,800. Lando starting 5th, Ricciardo starting 14th. So Ricciardo, the problem with McLaren is Lando projects as the 3rd highest flex player this week. So I think he makes for a really good fade because he's in that salary range where he doesn't have a lot of moving up the grid upside starting 5th. He's locked out behind the 2 best teams on the grid. You're paying 7,400 for basically a +5 and maybe a top 5 finish. But that's it. And he's going to be so popular that it just kind of makes sense to fade him. But it isn't a spot where I necessarily want to be pivoting to his teammate because Ricciardo isn't so cheap that he's giving you a ton of salary relief. He's way cheaper than Lando, but in terms of absolute value, 5,800 is still quite a bit, and he's starting down at 14. So I think McLaren is a pretty good fade. We might use them in a couple captain lineups, just if you're, as you'll see when we get to the section on captain and constructor. And if you look at the Run the Sims optimal rates here, we'll sprinkle some McLaren in since Lando's starting so high. But in terms of a flex play, I don't think Lando makes a ton of sense. I mean, yeah, he's starting high, but he's a player that's or a driver that's just going to be used in so many lineups. I think it makes a lot of sense to be really underweight on him. So if you look at our optimal rates, we have him a little above 30%, which is kind of on par with the field. But if you're only playing something like 10 lineups, I think you could play him in one lineup and really take that stand there. Moving on to Mercedes, both of these drivers are kind of in a no man's land with their salary and where they're starting on the grid. We have George Russell at 10K. He got that bump up in salary. over Hamilton, but he's starting down at 6. Lewis is down at 9,000. He is starting 8th. So they're kind of in that salary range where you really need first place upside. On this track, they just don't have that. We see, compared to the other high salary guys looking at the optimal rates, they're just way, way down there. We have them, using them in maybe 10% of our lineups, way less than 20%. When we get to the talk on constructor, we'll talk about them a little bit. But in terms of using them as a flex or in the driver position, they're just kind of in that no man's land. It's not a lot of upside unless you're using them as a just contrarian salary build. But we're not going to be doing that a lot with them given their really high salaries. Williams has been a team that we've consistently used for salary relief. We saw Albon get the bump up to 4K last race. Latifi has maintained his bare minimum salary at $3,000. Albon starting 16th on the grid. Latifi starting 19th. They're projecting almost the same in ownership. And this is likely because with salaries being tight, with it being very tough to jam Charles and Max together, there's only a couple lineups you can do that if you're using one of them as captain and Ferrari or Red Bull as constructor. People are just naturally going to use Latifi for salary relief. At the $1,000 gap, with Albon being only $4,000, I think it makes a lot of sense to have a lot more Albon this week, just because we aren't expecting a lot of overtaking. When the ownership projections are this close, I prefer to be overweight on who the better driver's been, who's more likely to get the +5. So we have them pretty close in terms of our optimal rates, but I think it makes a lot of sense to be overweight on Albon versus Latifi this week. One thing that I kind of went through this week, and something we haven't done on this podcast before, is talked about specifically the lineups that will be duped, and namely those ones that are combining Leclerc and Verstappen. I think the average DFS player or anybody that's been just looking at the first place, especially the first few weeks, they want to get the top 2 drivers in their lineup. And even though Verstappen is starting 4th, we've seen a lot of name value in Formula One DFS this year. And people really tend to lean on that name value. So you can't fit a Leclerc captain, Verstappen driver, Ferrari constructor team. It's not possible, but there are a couple combos you can fit, and I think they'll be duped hundreds of times, and we really want to be avoiding that. Like, if it's duped hundreds of times, you're playing that big tournament where 25K is going to first place. If you chop it up a couple hundred times, you're playing for a couple $100. So even if it is the optimal lineup, you just have no upside. So the lineups that really stand out to me that I'm really trying to avoid are Leclerc captain, Verstappen driver, Latifi, Stroll, Albon, and Red Bull constructor. That lineup's going to be used a ton. Another lineup that is going to be used a lot is the studs and duds Leclerc captain, Ferrari constructor combo. So that is most likely to be Leclerc, Vettel, Albon, Tsunoda. Vettel, Albon, Tsunoda, all starting way ahead of their teammates, all very affordable. And then the fifth driver, either Lewis Hamilton or Sergio Perez. So Leclerc, Vettel, Albon, Tsunoda, Ferrari constructor with either Hamilton or Perez. I would avoid those lineups a ton because they're going to be duped a lot. Let's get into what really drives our decisions, and that is the Run the Sims ownership projections. So the first thing that we really want to look at when we're thinking about our lineups is when you sign into DraftKings, what do you start with? Probably your captain, and then how you're going to exploit our optimal rates and the projected ownership. So if we go back to last race, we saw ownership split really evenly between Max and Charles and Red Bull and Ferrari. If I remember correctly, it was somewhere in the they were all 30 to 35%. because that was a race where even though Charles was on the pole, we had a pretty good idea that Max had a really good chance to win. He was the favorite. This week, Charles is a heavy favorite. There is not a lot of overtaking at Monaco. If he gets out of the first lap clean, it's going to be really hard to catch him. It's likely as a clean track all the way through unless something weird happens when he gets to the lappers. But because of that, ownership should heavily favor Charles in terms of the captain position. It should heavily favor Red Bull in terms of the constructor position. Because Sainz is starting on the front of the grid with Charles, he will eat some of Charles' ownership from the captain position. But think back to 2 races ago, we saw in Miami, we saw Charles at 48% captain ownership and Max down at 14%. Max is probably going to be in that range again. The problem is with Monaco being so tough to overtake and Max starting all the way back at 4th, I think we still need to be underweight on Max. It's tough to say because he's the best driver and the best car, but this track just doesn't set up for him to have a successful week. So if you have Charles lineups with Ferrari captain, the only way to get unique this week is going to be with leaving a ton of salary on the table. So in my Charles Ferrari lineups, that is going to be my main focus. Leaving salary on the table. Any combo you build that is close to filling out the salary, that's going to be due. People are going to be jamming Charles and Ferrari everywhere. So how do we get unique? We get unique with Charles as a driver and an alternate captain. We go back to that race where we couldn't fit Charles and Max together if either of them were in the captain. And the way you get unique is an alternate captain. And the one that really stands out, if we look at the optimal rates, is Sebastian Vettel. Vettel's starting at 9th at 3,800. If you put him in the captain position, you're able to get really unique with your lineups. And we're still going to use Ferrari in our constructor spot there, but we're going to be using Vettel a lot for that salary relief, and we'll probably be using Yuki as well, just because, again, he's in that kind of cheapish range, and he's going to let us get really unique there. I will also be using some Sainz captains, even though the optimal rate shows being pretty low on Sainz. If you look at the gap, if you look at the blue bar versus the red bar, we're using him a lot of the times as the captain, and that makes sense, right? If something happens to Charles, not a lot of overtaking on this track, both starting out on the front, Sainz as the alternate captain makes a lot of sense. So in terms of the most popular alternate captains we're going to be using, it is Vettel, it's Yuki, and it is Carlos. Now, when we look at the constructor, we have talked a lot about alternate stacks, alternate captain, constructor. I don't think this is a good week to get unique at the constructor position because with Red Bull and Ferrari starting out on the front 2 rows, there just isn't a lot of first place or even podium upside for the other teams. Obviously, we have Lando starting 5th, so if there is an incident, he has some podium upside. We're going to use him a little bit just because of where he's starting. But the problem is with Charles starting up front, and if he gets a clean start, gets ahead, he has a really good chance to lead every single lap in the race, to get the fastest lap. So even if something happens to Carlos Sainz, we saw this, I think it was 3 races ago, if Charles leads every lap, he can carry Ferrari as a constructor on his own. So again, I'm going to be using a lot of lineups where I'm using an alternate captain, Seb, Yuki, or Carlos, and then still using Ferrari as my constructor. Now, I'm not saying don't use other constructors, but we're just going to be overweight or on par with the field. This isn't a spot to be underweight on Ferrari in your constructor spot. I do think you can use a couple Mercedes lineups just because if there is an incident up front, you could get a double top 5 from Hamilton and George Russell. I think that probably makes the most sense in our Sainz captain positions. We could fit a Sainz captain, Russell driver, Mercedes constructor lineup, and you're going to be able to fit some other drivers comfortably. So I think that's a really good contrarian lineup. But again, this just doesn't set up as a race where we're going to be fading the chalk in terms of our constructor a lot. You see our optimal rates. We have Ferrari. They're going to make up over 50% of our constructor teams. Red Bull making up another 25%, and then just sprinkling in some other teams. I think if you're playing 20 lineups, you might be able to throw in one Alpine constructor team just because we have both of those drivers starting fairly well. If you're playing 150 lineups, maybe you throw out 4 or 5 Alpine constructors, but nothing too far outside of that. Now, with all that being said, the one thing that we've talked about a lot on this podcast is how much we're using our captain and constructor stacks relative to the field. Last week, we were kind of on par with the field because we were mixing up Max and Verstappen and Red Bull and Ferrari so much that it made sense to get back to that, like using 50 to 60%. 50 to 60% of the captain constructor stacks in our lineups. I think we're probably going to be doing that again. I think it makes a lot of sense to be using captain and constructor heavily. We have seen it work once where an alternate constructor works, so that stack won the race, but this just feels like a week where you're going to need that first place and the constructor stack to take it down. Of course, except for those alternates that we discussed, those cheap Seb and Yuki lineups, you don't need to do it. But as I mentioned, Seb's going to be in over 50% of lineups. We're going to use him as a constructor more than the field, but we're not going. But usually, if we're using Max or Charles, we're going to be stacking their constructor with them. Another stack that I've really been pondering, but it hasn't hit yet, has been the double driver. So like a captain with a constructor and then 2 drivers on the same team. Things need to fall pretty perfectly for that to happen. I think for that to hit, we're going to need a driver. Obviously, you're not going to get the +5 from both of the drivers, but you could get a lot of move up the grid equity in the right scenario. If a good team qualifies really poorly, like a Haas, if we have 2 affordable guys and one of them qualifies poorly, but we think it's a track where there could be some overtaking, like K-Mag starts back 16th or something with Schumacher starting top 10. This week, I don't think it's a good spot to chase those double drivers. Again, I know it hasn't worked. I think it's going to be a really good way to get unique at some point, but because we don't have a ton of overtaking, we don't have a lot of move up the grid equity this week, I don't love the idea of any double driver stacks this week. So if you want to recap on all those ownership percentages, as always, go to run the sims. You can get these optimal rates that we have up on the screen. You can get the actual projections in spreadsheet form and try to figure out who we want to be over or underweight on. But I think we should have a pretty good idea at this point. Let's move on to Underdog and the Pick'em. Underdog has released a Pick'em game for Formula One. We're going on the 3rd week, I believe, that it's available. We've been doing really well on it. You can get a free 4for4 DFS subscription if you deposit at least $10 on Underdog Fantasy using the promo code 4for4. And 4for4 Sam Hoppin has been using some win simulations, and we can use that to look at these pick'ems, and it gives us a really good idea of where these drivers rank or their likelihood of finishing near the top. And with these pick'ems, all we're really looking at is driver finishes or the rivals, how they're going to do against other drivers. So Sam's sim results really help with that. If we look at Run the sim results, we are looking at sim in terms of ownership. Sam's sim results on his Twitter, we can use these a lot for these pick'em games. So a couple pick'ems that I like this week. Charles Leclerc over 0.5 fastest lap. It's just such a good bet to make. I mean, again, Monaco, get out in front, get a clean start. They've been the fastest car all weekend. There isn't a lot of overtaking as long as the rain throws a big question mark into things in terms of cars possibly sliding. But if we're looking for a most likely fastest lap, I don't know if we have a more likely one than this week. I mean, even if like Red Bull tries to steal a fastest lap at the end, it's just a track where they're going to get stuck in traffic. It's going to be really hard for them to push it. So Charles Leclerc over 0.5 fastest laps. Esteban Ocon under 9.5 finishing position. Starting at 10th, he's had a lot of great pace. There could be some slippery stuff up front with them jockeying for position early. So with Ocon starting right there, I actually like Ocon to finish ahead of his starting position this week. Not the best qualifying ever, but as long as he could keep it on the track, I think that's a really good one to bet. Sergio Perez, obviously tough qualifying for him. I think there was some talk about him needing possibly a new gearbox, which could throw a wrench into things. But starting 2.5 spots, finishing 2.5 spots ahead of Lewis Hamilton, that's a really good rivals pick there. We see all the porpoising issues that Mercedes thought they had. I think Lewis said something to the effect of it feels like he's riding the bumpiest roller coaster ever. So Sergio 2.5 spots ahead of Lewis. I like that finish there. And then these really big gaps are often tough ones to figure out, but Alonso finishing 7.5 spots ahead of Mick Schumacher. Actually really like Alonso here. He's starting 8 spots ahead, but as I mentioned in terms of the Haas team, why I don't like fading Kevin Magnussen if we're going to be using Haas is because we've seen Mick make a lot of mistakes this year, and this is a track that you cannot make even the slightest mistake on, or you're going to be in the wall, you're going to be in a crash. Alonso, obviously one of the best drivers of all time, just a solid driver that isn't going to make a lot of huge mistakes. When he has had trouble this year, it's been some car issues or someone else running into him, but the likelihood of Mick struggling on this track I think is very high. So starting 8 spots ahead, I think there's a good chance Mick doesn't even finish this race. So if Alonso can even finish, I think that's a really good one. So Leclerc over 0.5 fastest lap, Ocon under 9.5 finishing, Sergio 2.5 spots ahead of Lewis, Alonso 7.5 spots ahead of Mick. That will be my main underdog card this week. Thanks for riding with me solo this week, guys. New to the solo things. Hopefully it wasn't too choppy, but we might have a couple more of these coming up because we are getting into the nitty-gritty of off-season football, and people's schedules are starting to fill up. So I might have to be riding a few more of these solo pods, but I enjoyed it. It's fun. Hopefully you guys have a good DFS week. We will be back in 2 weeks with the Azerbaijan preview. That should be a really fun race. As always, we are brought to you by Run the Sims. Go to runthesims.com and use the promo code 4for4 for 10% off USFL and F1 projections, tools, and content. And you can also see the link in the description if you don't want to type it into your browser. Underdog promo, free 4for4 Pro subscription. Deposit at least $10 on Underdog Fantasy using the promo code 4for4. And you'll also get a deposit bonus match up to $100. You must be a new user on Underdog. Also see that link in the description. Get in our Discord. We have a ton of pick'em, whether it's F1 or NFL futures. We're throwing those in there. And Best Ball is underway. The Best Ball Bible has been completed on 4for4 for all your strategy needs for Best Ball Mania. They just launched the Puppy Draft, which is another Best Ball tournament. So get logged into Underdog. If you enjoy this, please like and subscribe on our YouTube channel. If you're listening, please give us a 5-star rating on review, whether it's on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever else you listen. And as always, please give us a follow on Twitter. 4for4 is at 4for4football. Run the Sims at Run the Sims. Bet Spurts, all the good stuff is at Bet Spurts Golf. I'm TJ at TJ Hernandez. We will talk to you later.